creation ex nihilo in Buddhism. The doctrine of creation ex nihilo, or from nothing, is usually associated with biblical religions, most notably Christianity. However, that doctrine is often misread today, as in the modern world in general, to refer to divine will as determining all things beyond any reason, beyond intelligibility. The doctrine supposes that the act of creation stands as a kind of barrier between us and God. Things are created, and there's nothing else to be said about it. Ultimately, creation is a mysterious act that is beyond all comprehension, all human comprehension. For the will of God is a barrier of sorts, a barrier for reason. Now, this reading of the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo is completely fallacious. What creatio ex nihilo, or creation from nothing, tells us is that all things come directly from their source, and from nothing else, from nothing other than their source, which is to say that all things arise through emanation. Now, the language of emanation is found in scholars across the Middle Ages, and we find it in various places in Thomas Aquinas, who clearly represents Christian doctrine, medieval Christian doctrine prior to its modern modifications. He carries on a Platonic tradition that has as its notable representatives Boethius and Saint Augustine. Now, if we understand the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo in a medieval sense, then we see that far from constituting or representing a barrier between human understanding and the source of creation, and therefore the reason why things are created, the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo will bridge the two. It will tell us that there is continuity of understanding between the created and the creator, or the source and the product. Indeed, the continuity involves dialogue. It discloses dialogue. Now, if we take this reading, original medieval reading of creatio ex nihilo, as the correct reading of the doctrine, then we find the same in Buddhism, among other places. And here we're looking at a poem by Huineng, the sixth patriarch or patriarchal prophet of what is usually called Chan or Zen Buddhism. We're in the 7th century AD, and in a sutra, the Jingajing, we read that Puti bun, the root of wisdom, Puti is the Buddha's tree. Figuratively, it is indeed wisdom. Ushu has no tree, is devoid of tree. So the root of wisdom is devoid of tree. We can consider this in the light of Bereshit, where in Genesis, the biblical Genesis, where we find, of course, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is to say, of wisdom. Now, wisdom has no tree, but it has a root. Or indeed, it is the root, but it has no tree. If it has no tree, then it has no fruits. If it has no fruits, then you cannot take pieces away from it. You cannot appropriate wisdom or knowledge. Gnosis, scientia, sapientia. These are all synonyms. So wisdom is originally exarches, we would say in Greek, not a tree. So in the proper sense of the term, wisdom has no tree. It precedes the tree. Mingjing yi fei tai, the second verse of the stanza, the jitwa or the gatha in Sanskrit, it's a poetic composition, reads, nor is the luminous mirror a support. In the translation that is here proposed, Mingjing, the bright mirror, the luminous mirror, also, or in this case, given the earlier negation, Ushu, neither nor is this luminous mirror. Luminous mirror refers to the mind, a support, a stage. What is the significance of this proposition? If wisdom or knowledge is not a tree, it certainly has no branches, it has no fruits. The mind is equally not a support for something else. So there is nothing outside of the mind, nothing that builds on to the mind, just as nothing stems from wisdom or knowledge. In other words, everything is contained within that mirror, within that root, that wisdom as root. 本来无一物, from the beginning, 本来, 本, again referring to the first verse, the root. So beginning from the root, in the beginning, not a single thing. So there is nothing outside of the source. Wisdom, the bright mirror, the luminous mirror, is the source, but it is not a support, a stage upon which things are built. In other words, things do not escape from it, cannot be taken out of it. 何处惹尘埃? 尘埃 is the dust. 何处? Rhetorical question. In what place? 何 is the production, refers to the arising, the build-up of, in this case, dust. 何处惹尘埃? In what place? How could dust indeed accrue? The origin of things is not to be understood as something aside from things. And at the same time, of course, things are not to be understood outside of their source. There is then no place that things can be established into or build upon outside of their source. All things stand within their source. This is precisely the sense of creatio ex nihilo. All things emanate from within and back within their source. They never leave their source. All things stand in their beginning. There is then a kind of immediacy to things. There is no departure from that source. Does this not, however, suggest that there is no freedom, that there is no possibility of alienation from the source? It does not. The poetic stanza here is responding to another one, where we are invited to return to that minjing, that luminous mirror. In this poetic composition, we are reminded that a return to that bright mirror is predicated upon that mirror. In other words, it depends upon it. It is possible to return because the return takes place within the origin. So somehow the things that are disclosed by the mind through its wisdom, through its knowledge, are contained at once by that mirror. To return to the bright mirror, one is not to build upon works as St. Paul might have it. It is not our works that justify our lives. It is not through our works that we are free, that we respond properly to our origin. The problem here is one of alienation. How do we turn back? Teshuvah in Hebrew, repenting. How do we return in the sense of turning back upon the origin? And how do we sustain a stance whereby we're constantly turning back? This is the question of practical life. We do not advance outside of the origin, and yet we are to make an effort to remain turned toward that origin, an effort to return what is given to us, to witness that origin. That is the effort that defines the human being as the poet. This is what the doctrine of creation from nothing is pointing to. It is pointing to the fundamental condition of possibility of freedom, and to freedom as contained by that source of our being. Somehow, then freedom is not incompatible with its foundation. Indeed, the only way we can make sense of freedom, given the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, is as articulation, natural articulation of divine necessity. The necessity of the source articulates itself, and its articulation is what we call freedom. Who is free? What is free? Bodies are not free. The human being is free to the extent or insofar as he is the articulation of his source. That articulation is a logical one that is setting into action. It is the action of the source. The action is the word, the living word, the verbum, the logos of the nomos, of that law in a divine sense, which is to say that fundamental necessity, that absolute necessity. This is the classical and medieval, pre-modern in general, lesson, enlightened lesson about freedom, about necessity. The Machiavellian revolution has made it progressively difficult for us to understand this. It has alienated us from an understanding of freedom as the essential articulation of absolute necessity, by alienating means from ends, by positing a self an ego as grounded in a nature devoid, absolutely devoid of any mind. Reflection upon the classical and medieval doctrine of creatio ex nihilo helps us transcend our modern limitations.